For over 70 years, Prince Philip stood beside Queen Elizabeth II, loyal, composed, and often in the background. So when he chose to live apart from the Queen in his final years, the world was stunned. Rumors swirled, headlines speculated. But now, the truth is out. And it didn't come from the press, it came from Princess Anne. For years, the public speculated about why Prince Philip chose to live apart from Queen Elizabeth II during his final years. Was it health? Was it conflict? Or simply a desire for quiet? No one knew for sure, until Princess Anne broke the silence. In a candid conversation, supported by both King Charles and Prince Andrew, Anne revealed the real reason behind her father's decision. And it wasn't scandal. It was clarity. Anne, often called her father's closest child, shared a bond with Philip that went deeper than tradition. She inherited his bluntness, his wit, and his unwavering sense of duty. But more than that, she understood him, perhaps better than anyone else. While the world viewed Elizabeth and Philip as the perfect royal couple, Anne saw what most couldn't: the quiet sacrifices, the daily strain, and the constant compromise that defined their marriage behind palace walls. According to Anne, Philip didn't leave Buckingham Palace out of bitterness or fatigue. He left because he had given everything: decades of service, endless appearances, unwavering support. And in his final chapter, he wanted something simple: peace, independence, and time to be himself. After stepping back from public life in 2017, Philip moved to Wood Farm, a small cottage on the Sandringham estate. There, away from the pomp and protocol, he could enjoy the quiet routines he once missed: reading, carriage driving, painting, and living without a schedule. Anne explained it wasn't a rejection of the Queen. On the contrary, it was something they had discussed and agreed upon. A mutual understanding between two people who had weathered a lifetime of duty together. They remained close, speaking daily by phone and visiting regularly. Anne's revelation reframed everything. Prince Philip hadn't walked away from the Queen. He had simply stepped into a well-earned peace, supported fully by the woman he stood beside for over 7 decades. Before duty, before the crown, there was a quiet spark between a young princess and a displaced Greek prince. The love story of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip began not in grandeur, but in a moment of youthful charm and unexpected connection. They first met in 1934 at a royal wedding. Elizabeth was just 8 years old. Philip, 5 years older, didn't make much of an impression. But 5 years later, fate intervened. During a royal visit to the Britannia Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, a teenage Elizabeth saw Philip again, this time through very different eyes. A virus outbreak at the college disrupted the schedule, keeping Elizabeth and her sister indoors. Philip, one of the uninfected cadets, was tasked with entertaining the young princesses. He leapt over tennis nets, played croquet, and carried himself with a carefree confidence that captured Elizabeth's full attention. From that day forward, she was smitten. They began exchanging letters as Philip served in the Royal Navy during World War II. Elizabeth kept a framed photo of him in her bedroom, a silent, steady reminder of the man she believed was her future. While the world waged war, their bond quietly grew stronger. By 1946, after returning from the Pacific Theater, Philip proposed to Elizabeth during a visit to Balmoral. His letter from that year revealed a heart fully committed. To have fallen in love completely and unreservedly makes all one's personal and even the world's troubles seem small and petty. Still, not everyone was convinced. King George VI hesitated, fearing Elizabeth was too young and perhaps rushing into a lifelong decision. Others within the royal family objected to Philip's background: too Greek, too German, too brash. But Elizabeth would not be swayed. Her heart had chosen, and she would not look back. Finally, in July 1947, After Elizabeth's 21st birthday, their engagement was formally announced. Philip gave up his foreign titles, became a British citizen, and converted to the Church of England. He also took the anglicized surname Mountbatten. On November 20, 1947, they married at Westminster Abbey. What began as a teenage crush had grown into a partnership that would shape British history for over 7 decades. After their fairy tale wedding at Westminster Abbey in 1947, Princess Elizabeth and Philip Mountbatten began their married life not as monarchs, but as a young couple with hopes of a normal future. Philip, still serving in the Royal Navy, was stationed in Malta, and for a short time, they experienced something rare for royals: privacy. It was in Malta that their marriage briefly resembled that of any other young couple. Elizabeth joined Philip there for extended stays, while their children, Charles and later Anne, remained in England with royal staff. They attended parties, went to the cinema, and strolled local markets without fanfare. Philip excelled in his career, quickly rising through the ranks. He found purpose and identity in the structure and command of naval life. For Elizabeth, those Malta years were a brief but cherished window of normalcy. She got to be a naval officer's wife, without press cameras or court obligations constantly trailing her. It was a time of laughter, freedom, and shared adventure. But it wouldn't last. In 1952, everything changed. While on a safari in Kenya, Elizabeth received news that her father, King George VI, had died. At just 25 years old, she was now queen. And Philip, who had expected a lifetime of naval service, was suddenly married to the monarch. Their idyllic life in Malta ended overnight. They returned to the UK, and Elizabeth took the throne as Queen Elizabeth II. Philip was forced to resign from active naval duty and step into a role no one could clearly define: consort to the Queen. The transition was seismic. For a man used to giving orders aboard a ship, standing a few steps behind his wife in public and yielding to her status as sovereign was a bitter adjustment. He did it out of love and duty, but it came at a personal cost. Still, Philip adapted. He pledged loyalty to the crown and to Elizabeth, but the man who had once commanded destroyers at sea was now navigating palace politics and learning what it meant to live in the shadow of history. Their marriage, once anchored in equality and adventure, had entered a new chapter, one marked by duty, sacrifice, and the beginning of a lifelong balancing act between love and legacy. In 1952, Elizabeth became Queen of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth realms. She was just 25. The world watched as a young woman took on one of the most powerful and visible roles on the planet. But for Prince Philip, her ascension marked the start of a lifelong identity crisis, one that would quietly shape their marriage for decades. Philip was 30 when Elizabeth became queen. By then, he had proven himself as a capable naval officer and had expected to climb higher in the ranks. But royal duty demanded otherwise. He was told to give up his promising naval career to stand by the Queen, not as her equal, not as a king, but as a consort. His sacrifice was never framed as such in public, but to those who knew him, it was a heavy blow. To make matters worse, his new role came with no clear job description. He was expected to walk behind his wife in public, not speak out of turn, and be available but not dominant. For a man raised in naval discipline, accustomed to command, this ceremonial position was suffocating. Then came the issue of their family name. Philip assumed that, as the father, his children would bear his surname, Mountbatten. But powerful voices, including Queen Mary and Prime Minister Winston Churchill, insisted the royal line should remain Windsor. Philip was incensed. "I'm nothing but a bloody amoeba," he reportedly said. "I'm the only man in the country not allowed to pass his name to his children." The Queen, torn between her husband and the establishment, eventually found a compromise. In 1960, after years of tension, she declared that her descendants, not